Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Kris. This is Why Did Iran-Iraq War Happen? This is from the Intel report. If you can click that thumbs up for me, that helps out tremendously. Oh, Intel, yes. And subscribe to the channel. That helps out. If you don't want to, okay. You can donate to the channel through the thanks button. And if you do, you request a video, your name's sponsoring that video. You can still request without donating. It just takes a little bit of time. Just leave the video that you'd like in the comment. All right, let's get into the video.
On the 22nd of September 1980, the Iraqi Air Force launched surprise airstrikes on 10 Iranian airfields with the objective of destroying the Iranian Air Force. It was an attempt to emulate the Israeli preemptive airstrikes on Egypt during the Six-Day War, but the Iraqi strikes failed to inflict any significant damage. This marked the start of the Iran-Iraq War.
Hold on 7, this is Group 1, troops in contact. Coordinates to follow.
The attack was followed up on the ground the next day as Iraqi forces crossed the border in strength and advanced into Iran. The main effort was directed against the province of Khuzestan, an oil-producing region in southwest Iran. President of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, had expected a quick and decisive victory, but the conflict dragged on in an 8-year war of attrition that devastated both countries. Both sides eventually agreed to a UN-brokered ceasefire, and the war came to an end in August 1988. Outside of the world wars, it was one of the longest, bloodiest, and costliest armed conflicts of the 20th century, with scenes reminiscent of the Great War with the use of tanks, trench warfare, and human wave attacks. Iraq used chemical weapons on a massive scale and deliberately attacked civilians. Another notable feature of the war was the state-sanctioned recruitment of Iranian children as young as 12, who were glorified as martyrs for fighting against their Iraqi enemy. Iraq benefited from significant international support during the war, but despite this, the results were indecisive. There was no real victor, and the war did not result in any border changes or reparations. It is estimated that the war resulted in around 400,000 deaths, and cost hundreds of billions of dollars in destruction, and yet it ended with a return to the status quo that had existed before the war. At the end of the Great War, the Ottoman Empire was in ruins, and Iran was considered the preeminent power in the Persian Gulf. In 1932, Iraq became an independent nation, and a dispute arose with Iran over the control of the Shatt al-Arab waterway. The river runs along the southernmost border between Iraq and Iran, and is an important channel for both countries. For Iraq, it was strategically vital because it was their only access to the Persian Gulf for seaborne imports and exports. There had been a long history of territorial disputes over the Shatt al-Arab, but after the Great War, British advisors in Iraq kept the waterway binational under the Talweg principle, where the dividing line would run along the deepest part of a river channel. In 1937, Iran and Iraq settled their dispute. They signed a treaty that recognized the border along the low water mark on the eastern side of the Shatt al-Arab. This gave Iraq control over most of the waterway, and Iranian ships were required to fly the Iraqi flag, have an Iraqi pilot, and pay tolls. In return, Iraq agreed to sign a regional defense alliance with Iran, Turkey, and Afghanistan called the Sardabad Pact, which intended to protect the neutrality of Muslim nations if the world was plunged into another war. Following these agreements, relations between Iraq and Iran remained peaceful for several decades. This peaceful coexistence was disturbed in the early 1960s. At this time, Iran was the imperial state of Iran, ruled by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, after a US and British instigated coup in 1953 to overthrow the democratically elected government. With his Western backing, he began to assert Iran's position as the leading power and guardian of the Gulf. He built up Iran's military capabilities, and in April 1969, he abrogated the 1937 treaty over the Shatt al-Arab, and Iranian ships stopped paying tolls to Iraq. He argued that the treaty was unfair to Iran because almost all river borders around the world use the Talweg principle. Iraq declared this was a blatant violation of international law and threatened war over the move. On the 24th of April 1969, an Iranian merchant ship escorted by the Iranian Navy sailed up the Shat al-Arab and paid no toll to Iraq as required by the 1937 treaty. Iraq, being the military weaker state, allowed the ship to pass, but before long both sides were deploying military forces along the river. This led to a period of acute tension between the two countries, and in
Why couldn't they just agree to share the river, just splitting it down the center the entire way? And if I'm in your side, who cares? Like, is it really that important? Split it right down the middle, the river the entire way. Who cares? Just seems pointless. And I'll say this. Iran seems like they got the lesser of the deal when they signed that agreement. But there was this bad agreement. But kept peace, so it was a good agreement. Just right down the middle. That's how I look at it.
the early 1970s, Iran escalated tensions further by providing support to Kurdish groups who were fighting for independence from Iraq. Iraq's ethnic and religious divisions were far greater than Iran's. The main non-Arab community, the Kurds, had been constantly suppressed, and the majority of the population, the Shiite Muslims, were being ruled by a minority group, the Sunni Muslims. Kurdish separatism was a threat to Iraq because 2/3 of its oil production and oil reserves came from a predominantly Kurdish area. Kurdistan's fertile lands were also a major source of food production. There was a risk that Iraq could disintegrate into three entities: Kurdish, Shiite and Sunni. The government of Iraq had therefore always been adamant on keeping Kurdistan as an integral part of the country. Iran's support for the Kurdish insurgency resulted in a military confrontation between Iraq and Iran between 1973 and 74, but Iran's military strength was far superior, and the Iraqi regime saw no alternative but to seek an agreement to normalize relations and end the conflict. In March 1975, the nations signed the Algiers Agreement. Iraq agreed to recognize the border along the Tarweg, thus acknowledging Iran's sovereignty over half of the waterway. In return, Iran ended its support to the Iraqi Kurds, and the rebellion collapsed. The Algiers Agreement was seen as a national humiliation in Iraq. In the face of Iranian bullying, Iraq had paid a high territorial price, whilst Iran had made no concessions. In 1979, the status quo was disrupted again by the Iranian Revolution. The Shah was overthrown, and the imperial state of Iran was replaced by the present-day Islamic Republic. The Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had cultivated a close relationship and had been bankrolled by the West in return for being the guardian of the Gulf and acting as a bulwark against communism. This support had enabled him to consolidate his power as an authoritarian ruler, and he became increasingly unpopular with the Iranian people. He was exiled and superseded by the theocratic government of Ayatollah Khomeini, a religious Shia cleric who had been previously expelled for his opposition to the Shah. Khomeini fundamentally opposed the international system and espoused a militant religious doctrine calling for an Islamic world order in which territorial nation-states would be transcended by the broader entity of the Ummah, the universal Muslim community. He called for the Iranian Revolution to be exported throughout the world and encouraged Islamists to overthrow their governments to establish an Islamic republic. This was a great threat to many Arab nations, but the main thrust of his subversive efforts were directed against Iraq and President Saddam Hussein. Iraq was viewed as the main obstacle to Iran's quest for regional hegemony, and the large number of Shiites in Iraq deeply resented the long-standing discrimination exercised against them by the ruling Sunni minority. Iran resumed support for the Iraqi Kurds, provided aid to underground Shiite movements in Iraq, and initiated militant attacks against prominent Iraqi officials. Iraq initially tried to appease Iran and seek peaceful coexistence based on mutual non-interference in internal affairs. However, by the end of 1979, there was little hope of a peaceful coexistence, and Saddam Hussein moved to contain the Iranian subversive activities. He suppressed the underground organizations and attempted to organize a pan-Arab front against Iran. He also supported separatist Kurdish and Arab movements within Iran. These countermeasures heightened tensions, and the confrontation led to clashes along the border, which escalated into heavy fighting. On the 7th of September 1980, Iraq accused Iran of shelling border towns from territories which, according to the Algiers Agreement, belonged to Iraq, and demanded the immediate evacuation of Iranian forces from these areas. Iran announced that they no longer abided by the 1975 Algiers Agreement on land borders. On the 17th of September 1980, Saddam Hussein addressed his parliament saying, "The frequent and blatant Iranian violations of Iraqi sovereignty have rendered the 1975 Algiers Agreement null and void." He vowed to restore the legal position of the Shatt al-Arab to the pre-1975 status, saying, "This river must have its Iraqi Arab identity restored, as it was throughout history." 5 days later, on the 22nd of September, the Iraqi armed forces launched their attack on Iranian airfields, and ground forces crossed the border into Iran. There are two main explanations attributed to Saddam Hussein's decision to invade Iran in 1980. One view is that he struck Iran when it was weak, and when international factors worked in his favour for geopolitical gains. He sought to exploit the chaos caused by the Iranian Revolution to further Iraq's interests and assert its regional hegemony. He had been personally humiliated by the Algiers Agreement in 1975, and would do everything possible to reverse the power dynamic and to repeal it. Another more sympathetic view is that Saddam Hussein initially tried to appease Iran, but was forced into war as a last resort, fearing the spillover effects from the Iranian Revolution, which were a significant threat to his regime. His attack was a preemptive move designed to exploit a temporary window of opportunity in order to stop the Iranian threat. This view is consistent with Saddam Hussein's limited military aims, which did not go beyond the Shatt al-Arab and a small portion of the southern region of Khuzestan, where he hoped the substantial Arab minority would rise against their Iranian oppressors. Saddam Hussein did not try to deal a mortal blow to the Iranian army or try to topple the regime. He hoped a quick, limited and decisive campaign would convince Iran's revolutionary regime to desist from attempts to overthrow him and reach a settlement. Another view is that the war was first and foremost caused by two men with conflicting ambitions who used the war to hold on to and reinforce their personal power. Saddam Hussein and Ayatollah Khomeini believed the survival of their regime relied on the destruction of, or at least the weakening of the other. Thanks again to our amazing patrons who support.
It's just amazing how they could have peace, and then, over time, just different leaders, different ideas. Yeah. It's probably just one of those situations that they'll never get along anymore. They're just so anti the other. All right. Well, I was actually enjoying it. I was learning, and then it just ends. It's like, okay, well, didn't expect that. So, end it here. Till next time, have a good day, have a good night.